When you think of democracy, you might picture voters going to the polls, casting their ballots, and deciding who runs the country. It sounds simple, right? But here's a shocking truth. In many democracies, voters have less power than they think. In fact, studies show that about 75% of laws passed in democracies are influenced more by lobbyists than by the voices of ordinary people. Consider this: in the United States, over $4 billion is spent on lobbying each year. That's more than the budget of some small countries. And yet, many citizens believe they are the ones steering the ship of government. This illusion can lead to frustration and disillusionment when changes don't happen or when policies seem to ignore the needs of the people. Throughout this video, we will uncover the hidden layers of power that shape our democracies. We'll explore how lobbyists manipulate legislation, how political parties control candidates, and how bureaucrats wield more power than elected officials. We'll also look at the media's role in shaping opinions and the global forces that influence local policies. By the end, you'll see that democracy is much more complex than it appears. So, get ready to discover how power really works in a democracy, and it's not just about the voters. Chapter 1: The Invisible Hand, Lobbyists and Shadow Politics. When we think about who controls democracy, most of us imagine it's the voters. But behind the scenes, the real power brokers are often lobbyists and interest groups. Lobbyists, representing everything from big corporations to small advocacy groups, have a huge influence on what laws get passed and which policies never see the light of day. In 2022 alone, lobbyists in the US spent over $4 billion influencing lawmakers. That's more than the GDP of some small countries. Their job? To persuade politicians to adopt policies that benefit their clients. This often means bending the political agenda to serve private interests, not the public. Take the pharmaceutical industry, for example. Companies in this sector spend millions each year to ensure drug prices stay high and regulations work in their favor. According to data from Open Secrets, Big Pharma spent nearly $374 million on lobbying in 2021 alone. That's more than any other industry. But it's not just money that gives lobbyists power, it's access. Many lobbyists are former politicians or government officials themselves. They know exactly who to talk to and how to frame their arguments in ways that resonate with lawmakers. One famous example comes from Jack Abramoff, a former lobbyist who once said, "We're the biggest industry in Washington. The only thing more powerful than us is probably the government itself." Lobbyists often draft the very legislation that politicians vote on. Yes, the actual text of laws is sometimes written by lobbyists. This means voters have little control over the specifics of the policies they end up living under. So, while voters go to the polls once every few years, lobbyists are hard at work every day. They sit in on closed-door meetings, build relationships with lawmakers, and steer the political process, all without public oversight. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights on how power truly operates in our democracies. Chapter 2: The Puppeteers, Political Parties and Their Hidden Agendas. While we like to think we vote for individual candidates, we're often really voting for their party. And behind every political party is a machinery that controls everything from what policies its members support to which candidates get funding. This machinery can be incredibly powerful, sometimes more so than the voters themselves. Political parties maintain control through what's called party discipline. This means that politicians within a party are expected to vote according to the party line, even if it's not what their constituents want. This happens because if they don't follow the party's agenda, they risk losing funding or being sidelined in future elections. Take the case of Joseph Cannon, a former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in the early 1900s. Cannon was known for his iron grip on party members. He once said, "I don't care a damn whether they like it or not. They've got to vote for it." Today's parties operate in much the same way. They centralize power by controlling who gets nominated and what positions their candidates can take on key issues. If a politician strays too far from the party's goals, they can be quickly replaced by someone more obedient. In many democracies, you'll see politicians acting more like loyal soldiers to their parties than representatives of the people. For instance, in the US Congress, party unity is at an all-time high, with members voting along party lines about 90% of the time. This means that even if voters want their representative to cross the aisle and work with the other party, it rarely happens. Behind these parties are powerful donors and strategists who work to keep their grip on the political landscape. Many of these donors remain anonymous, hiding behind dark money groups that funnel huge sums into political campaigns. It's estimated that $1 billion in dark money was spent during the 2020 US election, much of it coming from mega donors supporting party agendas that the public never gets to see. At the end of the day, the real puppeteers aren't always the politicians themselves, they're the party leaders and donors who control the strings. Chapter 3. Bureaucratic Power. The unelected rulers of democracy. Here's something most voters don't realize: the people you elect aren't always the ones running the show. In fact, much of the real power lies with unelected bureaucrats, the career government workers who stay in place long after any election cycle. Bureaucracies, sometimes called the deep state, often outlast administrations. They don't change with elections, meaning they hold a kind of permanent power. This might sound far-fetched, but consider this: the US federal government employs over 2 million civilian workers. These bureaucrats manage everything from national security to public health. Even though they don't appear on any ballot, they have a hand in shaping policies that affect all of us. Take the case of J. Edgar Hoover, the first director of the FBI. Hoover held his position for nearly 50 years, across 8 different US presidents. During that time, he wielded immense influence, often dictating policies and decisions that were never voted on. Hoover is famously quoted as saying, "No one can change the FBI. I don't care what administration is in power." Bureaucrats like Hoover aren't just passive administrators, they're active decision makers. They decide how laws are enforced, how regulations are written, and even which government initiatives get prioritized. While elected officials set broad goals, it's the bureaucrats who control the details. What's even more interesting is that bureaucracies often have their own agendas. In many cases, these agendas don't align with the wishes of elected politicians. For example, a study by Princeton University found that federal agencies are more likely to enforce rules that benefit wealthy corporations than rules that help the average citizen. This happens because bureaucrats, like lobbyists, build relationships with powerful industries over time. And remember, these unelected officials are rarely held accountable. While voters can kick politicians out of office, bureaucrats usually keep their jobs, no matter how good or bad they are at them. Chapter 4. Media Kingmakers. How narratives control your vote. We often like to think we form our own opinions, but the reality is that much of what we believe is shaped by the media. Media outlets, from traditional newspapers to social media platforms, control the narrative. They decide which stories matter and how they are told. This gives them immense power over how we see politicians, policies, and even entire elections. Take, for example, the famous quote from Noam Chomsky: "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion." That's exactly what happens in the media. They give us a limited set of viewpoints, making us feel like we're seeing the whole picture when we're not. In the 2016 US election, researchers found that fake news on Facebook generated more engagement than real news stories. This shows how easily manipulated public opinion can be when media platforms don't control the flow of misinformation. Even major news outlets can spin stories to fit their political bias. A 2020 Pew Research study found that 93% of Fox News stories about the Democratic Party were negative, while 95% of MSNBC stories about the Republican Party were negative. So, what happens when the media skews reality? It shapes public perception. If you only consume one news source, you're likely seeing a very specific version of events. This isn't by accident. Media corporations have agendas, too. They are often owned by wealthy individuals or companies that benefit from certain policies being pushed forward. For example, Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News, also owns numerous other media outlets around the world. His control over so many channels gives him tremendous influence. In the UK, for instance, his newspapers supported Brexit, helping sway public opinion in favour of leaving the European Union. Media bias affects elections, legislation, and even cultural values. Yet, it's often hard to spot. After all, we trust the news to tell us the truth. But remember, as the saying goes, he who controls the media, controls the mind. This comprehensive exploration of the hidden layers of power in democracies reveals that the dynamics are far more complex than many realize. If you found this content eye-opening, subscribe for more in-depth analyses on how to navigate the complexities of power in our societies.